Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the video today, I'd like to share with you this design to make some geometric inspired shoulder grazer earrings. Now, I don't have a long elegant neck, but I do love big earrings. These don't weigh too much, so they're not kind of pulling your head over to one side, which is grand. If you'd like to join me down at the board, we'll take a closer look at how to create these together. So here are today's earrings. We've got this elongated sort of diamond shape down at the base. We'll be using a cylinder bead and a beautiful faceted rondelle. I'm also, as a bonus, going to show you how to make simple ear wires today. So let's just pop those up into the top. For the first part of the technique, we're going to be using two sections of 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and these are approximately 6 inches or 15 centimeters. So I'm going to give that a quick warm through between thumb and forefinger. And when I'm making earrings, I do very much prefer to create both halves side by side. So what we're going to do is to start approximately 1/3 of the way along that wire. And you can do these, as I say, side by side. It doesn't need to be exactly the same, but you will need to get those angles similar enough that they will pass for the same shape. So you might want to take a little bit more time than I am, or you can put those side by side and do that maneuver in one position. It just makes it a little bit tricky to show you. So what we're going to do is to work on the elongated diamond drop to begin with. So I'm just going to warm that wire through. Now, my favourite pliers in the world are these tapered bent chain nose pliers, but today I'm going to grab a pair of pliers that are flat and evenly spaced all the way along, so each of the sides of the plier is the same width at the joint and at the tip, and in that way we'll be able to get replicatable angles rather than kind of winging it with my beautiful bent chain nose pliers. So when you have ascertained what kind of size you want to go for, I'm actually just going to sharpen up that angle. I'm going to turn the wire further than I need it and then bring it back a little bit. You get a slightly neater angle, and you can obviously adjust that as you go. So I'm going to move probably around 3/4 of an inch down before bringing the wire back towards that centre line. If you imagine that we're working with an invisible line coming down the middle of your earrings, what we need to do is to create an aesthetically pleasing elongated diamond drop shape. So let's just restack those wires. We're definitely going to need to bring that angle in at the top. And if I just pop this down onto the handy line on my board, I'm going to need to change the angle back again to come up along that imaginary continued line. So if you stack those, then you will be able to get a repeated size and dimension, and all of your angles will remain the same. You can, of course, do yourself a little drawing, pop it down on the board and chase it in that way. Again, I'm taking that wire further than I need it and then bringing it back into position, hopefully getting a slightly sharper angle change. So let's just give that a slight nudge to ensure that they are identical. You can measure point to point to ensure that you get exactly the same, or you can pop it across your line and eyeball it. It's entirely up to you how precise you want to be. Geometric designs do in fact work really, really well if you take the effort to either measure or to just pop a little mark on that wire so that you can get a repeated angle. Let's just have a look at that, see what it looks like. I'm just going to separate them. So you can probably see already that the bend over on the left is too low down. So we need to pop that back in the jaws of those pliers and adjust it. You can prevent this by doing measuring, which is not something I tend to do on my videos, but it really does help. So I'm just going to move my pliers along slightly in the direction that I want that angle to come in, and then we'll pop that back down on the board and take another look. That actually looks much better. They look a little bit more similar, and they also look a little bit more equal. Another thing that you can do is to take the first side, measure it against the second side, and in that way you'll get that a little bit more perfect. So a couple of different options. You can of course just go for a measuring. So when I'm making earrings, I quite enjoy making them completely symmetrically opposite, which means that at the moment my tail of wire is passing over that angle change on both pieces. What I'm going to do is very gently just coerce one to go underneath. You need to ensure that all of your angles have remained the same, but what this means is I can switch those over, and as I start to draw this very last little tail of wire around the core before we introduce our cylinder bead, what it means is you'll have an exact mirroring on your earrings. Now the next part you do need to do one piece at a time, so I'm just going to pop one of those up and out of the way. I'm going to grip that tail of wire at the point it crosses over the angle change and turn it to a right angle. Whoops. And just make sure that you're happy that that sits exactly where you want it to sit. You might need to take a second just to ensure that all of your lines are good and straight. Working with geometric shapes does mean that if there's a little bit of a skew on that angle, it will be noticeable. So I'm just going to draw that over. We're not going to worry overly about that. That looks a bit more centralised to me. So I'm now going to support just past the point where that angle change has taken place. And I'm going to push the wire backwards, like so. What that means is as we start to draw the tail of wire around, we should be able to control this last angle on that diamond shape. What we don't want to do is to pull this tail of wire too hard and start pulling this section up, because then you don't end up with a diamond, you end up with a wonky, I don't even know what the geometrical shape is, where it's not equal to one another. So I'm just going to grip very firmly at that angle change and continue to push the tail of wire across the back of the design. And what you should see is that that still looks like a nice elongated drop diamond. What we're going to do now is to grip across both of those upper diamond angles, not so hard that you put any pressure on the wire that's bending around the core, but firm enough that when you bring the tail of wire around, you're not eating into your little section of wire over on the right hand side. And then every time you make a little movement, you can just tighten that up. Let's again grip across, but not pressing down where wire crosses over. Give that one last little twist around until we finish up with 2.5 or 3 visible wraps. And you will then need to repeat that in opposition on the other section. So I will do that off screen in a second. I'm going to elect this is the front of our design. So what I think I will do, grip again firmly but not putting pressure on any wrapped sections. I'm going to just push that across the back of the form and then flip to the rear side. We're going to trim away neatly with those flush cutters. I only put my finger in the line of fire because I don't want any bits and pieces to go smashing off into my studio equipment. So I'm just going to give that a tiny squish to make sure it's nice and neat and tidy. Very gently bringing this up so that it sits neatly. And if you have incurred any slight angle changes, you can just give that a very delicate touch to make sure it looks like a diamond. I'm going to flip that over the other way and make sure that that nice little section of coiled wire is neat and tidy, and just finish off by rotating those pliers around in the direction that the wire is moving. And what this will do is it will ensure that your cut end doesn't stick out and catch on things. So you'll just need to repeat that on the other side before moving on to the next stage. So I've taken a second to ensure that both of my forms are exactly the same, mirrored, so front to front on those pieces, and we'll move on now to the next stage of adding that beautiful cylinder bead. So I'm going to now introduce my lovely cylinder beads. Now these are 20mm by 10mm from Jessie James Beads, and I'm just going to slide that on the post up at the top. What we're going to do is to create a wrapped loop. So I'm going to pop my bent chain nose pliers at the top of that post and just twist that wire away to one side, and then I'm going to use the smaller side of my memory wire pliers. You could use round pliers, or you could indeed use your multi-step bail making pliers, and we're just going to create a simple wrapped loop So I tend to create half of a circular form first, just get that to sit at the top of that central core, draw the wire over the top, and then we're just going to seal that. Now, in order to help you if you have slightly reduced grip strength, what we're going to do is look at using 2 sets of pliers. Just make sure that that core wire remains in a straight line coming up through the top. If you need to adjust the angle of that circular form, you can just push that over slightly. We're going to use a second pair of pliers to assist and hold that round form. Not where the wires cross over, but as close to it as you can get. And then we're going to bring that tail all the way around that central core wire with our second set of pliers. Now you can use 2 chain nose pliers for this. I just happen to have those straight facing pliers on the board from when we were creating those 2 geometric forms. So just make sure that you're happy with how that looks and feels. Make sure that that last little cut section of wire is indeed flat to that core. And then double check that everything is as similar as you can possibly make it. So let's just pop those down for a second. What I tend to do before moving on actually is just give that a little bit of extra strengthening by squishing over the surface of that round form. And again, just make sure that you're happy with how everything looks. One thing I will point out is with these beads, there's an up and a down. So I have put one going up and one going down because I think that looks funky. But if you wanted to, you could ensure that they were both going in the same direction. So it's quite subtle, but the little arrows are pointing upwards on the right hand bead and they're pointing downwards on the left hand bead. I quite like the fact that they are different but the same. So that's the main part of our geometric shoulder duster earrings. Let's pop them down for a second. But I also wanted, as a bit of a bonus, to show you a very, very simple way of creating your own ear wires. An extra tool I'm going to use for this next stage is very technical. It's a nail buffer. So you can find packs of 4 nail buffers in your average pound store or Dollar Tree. They're not expensive at all, but they do help you if you don't have access to all silversmithing grits. Then you can use one of these to help smooth the end of the wire for going into a piercing. So let's head back down to the board and make those ear wires together and finish off our lovely shoulder duster earrings. So we're now going to be using 0.8mm gauge wire, approximately 4-inch lengths, and we're going to use 2 of those. I'm also going to add in some optional faceted rondelles. These are 6mm faceted rondelles in blush pink. So just put that up to the top corner for a moment. Now this is a very, very simplistic design for earrings, and again it really helps to make these the same. So I'm just going to give them a warm through. They've both been previously flush cut. For the first step, we're actually going to make the small loops independently. It helps if I get round pliers for the job. And for ease of seeing on the screen, I'm going to use the large side on my memory wire pliers. However, in usage, I would normally go for the small side. But just to make it easier to demonstrate the technique, I'm going to start off by creating a round form. Just bring that wire to pass back along the start point. And we're going to do that twice. The reason I don't put them in the pliers at the same time is that it all goes a little bit gnarly if you do. I'm then going to use my favourite pliers to bring that wire away just before the end. And then I'm going to manually push that into position. So you get an eye pin, as it were. So you've got that round openable loop or a simple loop on the end of that post. And again, just before the end of the wire transects the tail of the wire. Now you can see here that loop isn't centralised on the end. So it's very, very easy to just push that until it sits centrally on the end there. And then what we're going to do is add a lot of strength across that piece. Now the reason we're using 0.8mm or 20 gauge wire is that this will go through most lobe piercings. I can't speak for other piercings, I'm not a piercing expert, but I do know that most lobe piercings will work with either a 0.7 or a 0.8mm post. So let's give those a bit of a smooth through. The next thing we're going to do is add on our optional beads. If I can pick those up. So these are a blush pink AB coated faceted rondelle at a 6mm size, but you could obviously make that a lot smaller and more delicate if you're going for delicate earrings. Now in my jewellery that we've created together today, my loop sits flat to the desk, which means that I will need the loop on my earrings to be at 90 degrees so that when we put these together, those two will link. So that's something to bear in mind. So I'm going to make sure that both of my loops are at 90 degrees to the desk, and I'm going to push those beads all the way down. Let's do this one at a time. Just to help me, I'm going to overemphasize the angle. So my loops are at 90 degrees to the desk, and I'm going to push that wire forwards. Now it does not need to be at that great an angle. It's usually about 25 degrees rather than the 45 to 50 degrees that I've shown here. But it just enables me to show you a little bit more what the angle is required, where it needs to be. So I've popped a little bit of a gap there, which enables this bead to spin and move around. You can have a smaller section of wire up there if you like. I'm using these because it means that it's a repeated dimension without too much effort. The next piece of tooling that we're going to need is a round form. Now you can use your multi-step bell makers, you can use your wooden mandrel set, or you can use a marker pen or whatever you have basically. So the next thing we're going to need to do, if I just put those side by side, we're going to need to ensure that we try to get these as close as possible in the next section of the tutorial. So I'm going to add a little bit of warmth through the tail coming away from that angle change, and I'll do that on both pieces of wire. And I will absolutely, even though it will be a little bit tricky, we'll do this in the same maneuver because I want these two to be as similar as possible. So I'm just going to hold them with my forefinger sitting between those two loops, and then I'm going to apply the 6-step bail makers into position. Might be easier to see if I just hold them like so, and just get those to sit side by side in the loop, and then ensure that they're at the same distance. So you can just gently move those until they sit exactly where you want them to. And then I'm going to start rotating that wire around. Now you may find that it twists slightly out of your control. Don't worry, you will be able to just move that if you need to. So the reason I made that angle a little bit more than necessary was to show you the kind of kidney shape wire that we're making together today. Now what that looks like to me is far too long, but that's probably because we've got quite a long amount of wire to work with. So you can play around with that design to your heart's content. I think I'm going to make those a little bit smaller. In order for that to be easier to see, I'm just going to pop pliers into one of those earring findings and just rotate the wire around until I get to a dimension that I like, and then strongly pull away the straight tail. Now that looks like a much more reasonably sized earring finding to me. If you put them side by side, you'll see that the first one is really far too long. So it will dangle very, very low down, and the angle will all be a little bit weird. So I'm just going to pop that number 6 in again, rotate the wires around, and then I will continue to offer them up to one another until I get them to match. If you don't have a camera to show that to, you can do those two side by side. When you're working to a camera, it restricts the angles that you can show. So you might be able to see that one of these angles is slightly different to the other. So I'm just going to grip on the straight part, push that wire a little bit until they sit on top of one another and are equal. So that looks pretty reasonable to me. So what we're going to do is just pull the two tails away in a gentle arc. And I'm going to truncate these earring findings just at the point that they cross over where the little bead is above the hook. Now that's just from a point of balance. You can make it longer or shorter to your preference, but I think that they will balance nicely if I trim that away just about where the bead is. So let's grab those tails and pop them in the scrap pot. What we're going to do next is put a teeny tiny kick on the end of the part that goes through the piercing. I'm just going to put a very, very small turn just on the end, and I'll repeat that on the other side. Again, if you do these side by side, you'll be able to make sure that it's completely replicated on both sides. Now, in an ideal world, we're going to need to hammer these because although we need that 0.8mm to fit through the piercing, what we don't want to do is to have a weak wire. So before I hammer them, I'm just going to make sure that they do in fact look exactly the same, and then we'll pop back here and we'll hammer the right part of this earring finding. So I've just taken a couple of seconds to make sure that they are indeed identical. So we will now show you whereabouts you can hammer on this piece without making it difficult or uncomfortable, but also making it strong enough to last in wear. So we're going to need to apply 2 different strengths of hammering for this design. The first half, which is kind of just past the midpoint up here at the top of the part that goes through the lobe, we're going to be very, very gentle. And even though that's a very gentle hammer, you'll find that it really does change how the wire reacts to being touched. You'll also note that I took pains to cover up that lovely crystal that we have. The next part that we're going to hammer is from just past that central point down towards the angle change above the crystal. So again, I'm looking after my crystal. I'm also supporting the end of the earring finding, so that we don't allow the whole thing to come out of shape. So what we're looking for here is a slight change in the contour of that wire. You'll notice that on the rear side, as we're looking at it, that's a little bit shinier, a little bit flatter. And on the front side, it's still nice and round so that it works on your piercing adequately. So what we're going to do now, before we offer this up to the ear, is find our preferred buff. And we're going to give that a little bit of a coarse buff first, just on the section that goes through the ear piercing. Now, whilst I have flush cut this, I just want to make sure that there are no rough edges. So if you don't have a burr cup file, then you can use one of these just to give a very, very gentle touch up around the ends, especially ensuring that that's nice and flat. Now, a 4-way buffer normally has 4 levels of grit or 4 levels of finesse. So it's a very cheap tool to be able to afford. Let's have a look. Where's number 3? There it is. Not sequential. So just go through your grits, as it were, until you're happy that that's nice and smooth. Obviously, you don't need to condition it in the same way that you would your fingernails. And then it's just a case of making sure that that loop is nice and strong. You could pop that on the edge of the block and give it a very, very gentle tap, or you could open and close your pliers to make sure that that's a nice, strong, simple loop. Before you open that up, make sure that you're putting the front of your design towards the front of the earring. Close that up and you are ready to wear your geometric inspired shoulder duster earrings. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed making these with me today. I look forward to seeing you again here on the Gemhawks YouTube channel very, very soon. Bye for now.